Okay, so hello everyone. This time we're going to look at some alternative openings for black against d4. So we previously looked at d5. Oh, let's just switch that to openings. With the Queen's Gambit and all the various things that come from that. But there's obviously options and alternatives, and possibly the most, well, far and away actually the most common black reply to d4 is knight to f6. And this will lead to what are called, generally called the Indian games, the various Indian defenses. And the basic idea of most of the Indian defenses is that black will allow white to have quite a big center, quite a lot of presence in the center, and black will then try to undermine it as quickly as possible by attacking against that center. So we'll try to prove that it's actually too advanced, that it's a weakness, that white's overstretched. So we're only going to look very quickly at each of the Indian defenses. Why are they called Indian defenses? Well, I believe a couple of hundred years ago, Indian chess rules didn't have the two moves for a pawn on the first move. So all of the pawns had to move one square at a time. And so it was very common for the knight's pawns to move one square forward and the bishop to appear in what we call now the fianchetto. And it's kind of just stuck that they're all now known as the Indian games. So the other thing to say, most of the Indian openings you can also play as white, and they're perfectly safe, perfectly sound, but because of the extra move, black won't have the time to occupy the center in quite the same way. So the nature of the game is a bit different, but the actual moves would be perfectly okay for white to play as well. So let's start with the King's Indian, and that's this move order here. And white's most common here is e4, could play knight f3, d6. And now we just have, that's the basic, we have the basic of the King's Indian. Lots and lots and lots of theory on this. I mean, just the chess.com database has got tens of thousands of games. Look, it's quite combative, quite a high percentage of wins for white relative to what you'd expect, but slightly fewer draws. So yeah, and it's a counter-attacking opening, as I say. Black is allowing white to have this big center, but in return thinks that he or she will be able to attack it from the sides. And that's the basic pattern of all the Indian defenses. So we'll just play a few more moves just so you can see. Typical, we'll play the most common moves that are on offer each time, just so we can see what might happen. Here we go, e5, immediately trying to hit the center. What happens if takes, queen takes? I mean, we're just seeing a few moves here, really, just so you can see what's going on. Knight takes e5 doesn't work, by the way, because knight takes e4 uncovers an attack here from the bishop. Anyone was wondering. So yeah, let's go back a bit. So that's the basic plan, is black will allow white to have this big center, but will try to break it up. So that's the King's Indian. It's very counter-attacking, quite risky opening. Nothing wrong with it at all compared to any other opening. It's fine, but just be prepared as black to really, as quickly as you can, attack the center. Otherwise you might get swished. As you might expect, if there's a King's Indian opening, there's a Queen's Indian opening. And we're going to play this move order. And then b6. And now we have the Queen's Indian defense. And this one, we can look at the results, slightly different in nature to the King's Indian. Far fewer white wins, but also fewer black wins, and rather a lot more draws. And at Grandmaster level, it's a much safer opening for both sides. A lot less is going to go on early, a lot less tactical. And it's a very, very safe opening, therefore, for junior players to play and beginners to play, because you're not going to get yourself into any trouble early. The most common thing for white to do is to put a bishop on g2 to fight against the black one that's probably going to, that might end up on b7. Black can play bishop here or bishop here. I mean, if that white bishop's going to change diagonal, then black might want to use this one that it's left. But you get the basic idea. I'm just going to play that because We just want to see what's going on. Bishop e7. This is just typical safe developing moves. Castles, possibly castles. And again, say nothing really wrong with this. There are better options for black. Black should play bishop a6 earlier, really. But I just want to show people what's going on. So this is the basic structure for the Queen's Indian defense. But just be aware if you're playing as black that sometimes coming all the way out to a6, as you can see, in fact, is better than stopping at b7. Okay, so there's your Queen's Indian defense. And we also have something called the Nimzo Indian. So white will usually play knight f3 here because they want to avoid the Nimzo Indian defense. And that's this move order here. And this one turns into, again, a battle for the center, particularly the e4 square. So this bishop has now pinned the knight to the king. So white can't play e4 because knight takes pawn is just winning a pawn. Knight takes knight's no good because the bishop takes the king. So white will usually either ignore e4 and just go for developing moves, or possibly queen to c2 and then think about playing e4 anyway. That's an option. And for black's part, usual kind of thing will take place. You might have d5, you might have c5. One thing you shouldn't be afraid to do as black in this variation is play bishop takes knight if you have to. There's nothing wrong with it at all. It does give white the two bishops, but it's certainly not a disaster. As you can see from the scoreboard, white wins fewer games than normal. Black wins slightly fewer games than normal and considerably more draws. So nothing wrong with it again. Perfectly okay. So that's the King's Indian, the Queen's Indian, and the Nimzo Indian all done. I think we'll look at the Gruenfeld defense next. So the Gruenfeld starts off looking like the King's Indian. And now black can risk playing d5 here. And this is what's called the Gruenfeld defense. And I think we'll just look at the most critical line. White can just develop normally, knight f3, bishop f4, blah, 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 and that's perfectly safe, perfectly fine. But the most critical variation is this one. And takes, e4, takes, and now you can play c5 straight away, but usually black will play here first. The knight develops, and now c5. And it's this typical thing in all of the Indian defenses where white has a huge center, a really strong center, but black hits at it from the side. Look at everything ganging up on d4. So this pawn is, this bishop is, this queen is. The knight might come to c6 and hit at it. And you get this complicated position where each side is trying to prove that either the white's trying to prove their center is a strength, black's trying to prove that actually, no, you've overreached, you've gone too far. So really imbalanced game, and much lower than you might expect. So we normally say 40, 30, 30 is a good guide. So slightly lower number of white wins, slightly lower number of black wins, rather a lot more draws, interestingly. But yeah, so that's your Gruenfeld defense. What else have we got? We've got the modern and the Pirc, so we better look at those. So the modern defense for black is basically the first two moves against anything. Doesn't really matter what white plays, we play here. And this can turn into the King's Indian. For example, there, and there, and we've turned it into the King's Indian. It can obviously turn into the Gruenfeld as well, depending on what's been played by white. But once again, the modern defense, the basic idea, dunk, 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 and counter-attack against this center. Okay. We'll show you the Pirc defense as well. So white may choose to play knight c3, in which case you'll have d6, not knight f6 straight away, because e5 will be a pain. f4, knight f6. And we're into the Austrian attack, the Pirc defense. Same old thing applies. Big white center. White's going to try and crunch through the board because of all this extra space. Black's going to try and break that wall of center pawns up and prove that it's more of a weakness than a strength. And that, you can see, is actually about right. Our 40-30-30 guide is near enough spot on. So that's the Pirc defence. And the thing with the modern and the Pirc in the King's Indian is because black's basically playing the same few moves in whatever order, they tend to turn into each other quite easily. Another move order that the Pirc comes up quite regularly is I will play here, and if you find white plays here, d6 is then quite an interesting move because it's completely blunted this bishop. So if white wants to play the London attack, the bishop f4 system, d6 is quite a good way of dealing with it. And you can see it's actually black in master games that has the majority of the wins. That's considerably higher than you might expect. And let's just play some moves. It will carry on something like this, the typical pattern. And there it is again for these Indian games. And sometimes black will play here, sometimes here. It'll be c5, it'll be e5. At some point when you're ready, you're going to get castled. But always the same pattern. Big white center, black tries to break it up. So that's fine. There's also the possibility of the opening that's favoured by a player, an international master called Charlie Story, as he calls it, the sniper. And I've read his book on it. And basically he plays the same first three moves against anything at all. And with some success, sometimes called the pterodactyl defence. It'll often involve the queen coming out early. I think if a computer played a computer with the sniper, you would probably find white had the better of it. But as it's very unusual, it's not a bad system to learn at all. And not least because you're the one getting it on your territory, playing the same first three moves every time. So that is another option. I'll just show you one really weird position that comes up from the sniper, just to give you an idea, a clue of how complicated it can be. And look at this mess here. Now, admittedly, it does say white wins quite a high proportion of games, but I think a lot of that, judging from reading Story's book, is because in this line, black castles kingside too often. So queen a5 is the most common move. Queen d4 is not the most common, but it is probably best. And then, yeah, knight f6 kind of has to play it to protect the bishop. But where white frequently goes wrong, black frequently goes wrong, is with these weak black squares, black will castle kingside. And arguably, you shouldn't. Arguably, you should leave the king in the middle. But anyway, that's too deep. We don't want to go there. So that's the sniper. g6, bishop g7, c5, or sometimes called the pterodactyl. And you can play it against pretty much anything. The other ones we will look at the Benoni and the Benko Gambit, and then we'll wrap this one up. So the Benoni comes up here. So after these two moves, c5. And now what's white going to do? Well, white can just be safe and boring about it and just develop. But if they do that, then black's equalized pretty comfortably, which is great. So we're happy with that. The critical thing to try is to push the pawn forward and cramp the black position. And then the most common two moves are e6. White will develop one of the two knights. It doesn't make a great deal of difference which way around. Takes, d6, because we don't really want white playing d6 themselves. It becomes very complicated if they do. We play there. Knight to c3 is most common. And now g7. Bishop e7 is doable, but g7 better. e4 is most common. Bishop here, and that's as much as I want to say on the Benoni or show of you the moves. But here's the point: black has a potentially ook pawn for later in the game, and white definitely has a bit more space in the center. But look at the potential of this bishop cutting across these black squares. And what's going to happen is white is likely to have an attack on the king side, the bishop, the other bishop, the h pawn might go forward. Black is likely to be playing these two pawns forward, and you get some really interesting, complicated chess coming up from it. So the Benoni defense, nice imbalanced pawn structure. And you can tell it is because white is winning slightly more than 40, but black's winning slightly more than 30, and therefore fewer draws. So it's definitely quite a combative system, really, really interesting. And if you really want to take a risk as black, well, you can. When white plays d5, you also have the Benko Gambit. And this will be the last one I look at in this presentation, where black plays the interesting b5. And again, percentage-wise, slightly higher than you'd expect for white, probably about right, maybe a little higher than you'd expect for black. Few draws. So it's very, very it's risky chess. People are trying to win with this. And white, again, can just develop, just ignore it, just play normal developing moves, absolutely fine. But the critical line would be something like this. Black offers another pawn, so we're just undermining the support of the white centre all the time. Things white can do, white can just develop. E3 is fine. I imagine knight c3 is probably okay, although it doesn't look like it has the best. White can try giving the pawn back. That happens. I really want to show you the critical line, the main line. We don't need to capture this straight away as black. What we'll do is play g6. D6 doesn't really do white any favours here. We won't go into why. Now we'll take it. E4, because white's going to occupy the centre. But that allows bishop takes, king takes. D6, because we don't want the pawn being pushed now. Again, just have to take my word for it on that one. We just don't. Bishop g7, and we'll stop here. And what have we got? We've got white a pawn up. But look again at this incredibly strong bishop. There's real potential for this bishop here, pointing at the queen's side. Black's going to have these two half-open files that eventually will have the two rooks and possibly the queen on, attacking these two pawns down these files. So black's a pawn down, but has a lot of counterplay. For white's part, bigger centre, yeah, white's a pawn up. It's going to have to spend a couple of moves undoing this problem of the king not having castled, so g3 is the most common move. Just play a couple more moves. And then knight bd7, and yeah, so again, it's interesting. Slightly lower at this point for black wins, by the way, which is interesting than we might expect. But it's just interesting combative chess. So yeah, so that's the Benko Gambit. Just another option. So I think that pretty much gives us most of the normal options against d4. If you don't want to play d5, you can do some other things. c5 straight away, okay. b5 gets played occasionally. e5 you'll come across in blitz games. It's not sound, the England Gambit. It is better for white, but if black doesn't know what they're doing, they're going to get into trouble. Sorry, if white doesn't know what they're doing, they'll get into trouble. It's just better for white. The other thing you've got is the Dutch defence here, which again, it's roughly around our 40, 30, 30. But just sensible development is fine for white against the Dutch defence. Just black needs to be a little bit careful. We don't end up with queen. Look, I mean, imagine we don't want to be playing. Here's the From Gambit. We don't have Storm Gambit. We don't want to be playing that and getting checkmated. That would be really, really bad. So just have to be a bit careful as black, but that's perfectly playable as well. So there's the Dutch defence. But anyway, really this one was all about the different options after d4, knight f6, or d4 and g6. So what's called the Indian openings, the modern openings. Okay, well, I know that was a little detailed and a little complicated, but if any of them particularly take your fancy or you found them particularly interesting, if you go online, you're going to find loads of YouTube videos on the different openings. You're going to find loads of books, and perhaps one of them might become your speciality. Who knows? Right. Thank you for today. That was great. See you next time.